couldn't buy anything, right?
There goes Dollarama.
Yeah, and besides, I mean, they said they're going to impose sanctions on China. Well, I mean, you know, China could simply say, well, listen, if you impose sanctions on us, no more made in China. The whole North American economy collapses overnight. But, well, that's a sideline. But the thing is that in addition to, if you could go down a little bit in addition to these very intricate, right, a little bit up, yeah, stay like that. In addition to these plans to blow up countries, so we're not talking about something in the abstract. Those plans are there. Okay, when I use the term World War III scenario in my book, didn't invent the term. It was a Pentagon concept. Okay, they had already a plan to implement World War III, and here you have the Rand Corporation. This is a recent 2015 study commissioned by the U.S. Army. The Rand is more or less the think tank of the Pentagon. Now, this is just summarized here, but just to emphasize the diabolical nature of U.S. foreign policies, it says, well, at some time in the future we're going to wage war on China. Okay? Thinking the unthinkable, but then they look at all the different avenues. China's not going to attack America. First of all, it's not part of their history. They've never, they're traders essentially, trade and investment, but that's what they're scared of, the United States. But this thing is a scenario of a nuclear war where the United States essentially threatens China and saying, well, if you react, we're going to win the nuclear war and we'll destroy the whole country. Okay, and they go through various scenarios again of how they can destroy China and come up with a winning hand. But now the fact that this kind of document is released, not really meant for the broader public. It's meant for the think tanks in China to look at, right? To say, we know that you know, okay? They look at these, they read these reports, okay? But it's also perhaps intended for decision makers in high office. And I think that one thing that I've been able to observe in that regard is that people in charge of decisions in the Pentagon, the State Department, or the CIA, they believe in their own propaganda. There is a propaganda for decision makers. And now if you ask Donald Trump about nuclear weapons, he'll say they're harmless for the surrounding civilian population. Or he might say, I don't care, but the thing is that people who are deciding on the use of nuclear weapons will read this nonsense in the military manuals, okay? It's that the three-star general will say it's classified as a conventional weapon, it's part of the toolbox. That's a military term. Now the toolbox is a whole bunch of weapons and you can pick and choose and you have to optimize and be efficient, okay? I've gone through this literature, but it's very scary because it says it's optimization. I mean, economists do that kind of nonsense, but we're optimizing, maximizing profit. Yes, professors. But so the toolbox is here. I don't have my bag. And then they say, we have to attack this country. And then what do we have? The Kalashnikovs on one side. And then we've got, oh, the B-6111 there. Yeah, so take out the B-6111. You read the label, harmless to civilians. Yeah, let's use it. There's a whole area of propaganda we are incited to believe in the war on terrorism, that Al-Qaeda is threatening America. They also believe it. Well, some of them don't, but I mean, they have to believe it if they want to retain a certain level of decency and legitimacy. Okay? And if somebody discovers that the terrorists are being funded by, the Pentagon, well, but that's only some strand of, and they're moderates, they're not really terrorists, etc. But the process of creating a consensus within the decision-making structures, complex as they are, Pentagon, State Department, intelligence, US Senate, Senate committees, congressional committees, is based on this notion that you ultimately believe that you're doing the right thing. And you believe in your own propaganda, and of course you're paid to believe in your own propaganda, ultimately. Because the scientists are paid to lie on the description of the bomb, and then the people in the Senate are there to endorse this on behalf of the people who make the bombs. Okay? And this all goes back to a secret meeting which was held on the 6th of August 2003 at Strategic Command Headquarters in Nebraska, where the private sector got together with the military brass and devised a plan to develop nuclear weapons. I can give you details on that, but that was not reported, of course. It was held behind closed doors. There were a couple of reports on it. But again, it's also the privatization of nuclear war. And because ultimately you have $1 trillion now weapons program, which is yielding tremendous profits for a handful of so-called defense contractors. Now let me turn to North Korea. We've already discussed some aspects of the history of nuclear weapons. As I mentioned, the threat against North Korea came in 1950 to use nuclear weapons prior to the onslaught of the Korean War. And it was also directed against China. And as you know, China played a key role in the Korean War. It was the Chinese Volunteer Army. And they are one of the signatories of the Armistice Agreement of 1953. But what people don't know is that as of in fact, even before that, officially 1958, the United States established its nuclear weapons facilities in South Korea. And at the same time, that was 4.5 years after the end of the nuclear war, of the Korean War, they started developing their facilities in South Korea, and they kept those facilities for a period of over 20 years. I don't have the exact dates, but they eventually, the technologies evolved, so they didn't need to have them right on the Korean Peninsula. But what is also important to stress is that the Republic of Korea, namely South Korea, also had a nuclear weapons program. And it didn't seem to bother anybody. And they had a nuclear weapons program which started in the early 1970s, and it went on, I don't have the exact, yes, it went on for 20 years. It was curtailed in 1991. It was, in a sense, an appendage of the US project, but in fact it had its own, it was Korean scientists and engineers and so on that put it together with the support of the US. But the idea of the US was to establish South Korea as a nuclear power. And they were for 20 years. And then officially officially the program was discontinued when the United States in the 90s moved to other forms of deployment of their nuclear weapons from submarines and aircraft carriers, or from distant air bases, because the technology had evolved. But now, what we have to understand, and yes, it was from the continental United States and from US submarines, so they discontinued that. But fact of the matter is that South Korea is a nuclear weapon state. And while I'm at it, I'd like to mention some other nuclear weapon states that you have never heard about. Can you go down with the map? I need it's much further down. We have some problems. Yeah, up a little bit. Okay. Now, Belgium is a nuclear weapon state. The Netherlands are a nuclear weapon state. Italy is a nuclear weapon state. Germany is a nuclear weapon state. And Turkey is a nuclear weapon state. Turkey has 5 times more nuclear bombs compared to North Korea. It has 50 tactical nuclear weapons in their base in Incirlik. Belgium and Holland together have 5 times more. Now, these countries are using nuclear weapons made in America, but they are undeclared nuclear weapon states because these nuclear weapons are under national command, okay? They're under national command. So that irrespective of who makes them, and by analogy, incidentally, Germany, well, Germany is among this group of 5 countries, but Germany just so happens to make nuclear weapons for the French Navy, okay? That's within the context of joint ventures. It's the EADES, the EADES conglomerate, European Air Defense Systems. Yeah, that's it. It's this conglomerate. It's the alliance between Deutsche Aerospace on the one hand and Aerospatiale Matra. Okay, and as a result, but the dominant shareholder is still Germany. It's still Deutsche. It's still the it's still the German component which dominates this industry. So they produce nuclear weapons for the French Navy, but they are considered as a non-nuclear state. In fact, they are a nuclear state, because they not only do they deploy US-made nuclear weapons, but they also fabricate nuclear weapons for France. And so if we start to look at the issue of North Korea and all the non-declared nuclear weapon states in the world, we'd say that this is a clear case of double standards. This country, which is threatened, has been threatened for 67 years, decides at one point in its history to develop its own nuclear weapons program as part of the deterrence, okay? Whether we like it or not, we may have different opinions on that, but on the other hand, Turkey has nuclear weapons, Holland, Italy. The ones in Italy are all directed against the Middle East, okay? The ones in Belgium are directed against the Middle East and Russia. Now, is Belgium a nuclear weapon state? Yes, because it has, as you see from the graph here, Belgium has B-6111s 20. Okay? That's double what North Korea has. Small country in Western Europe, US technology. Now, let me return to the Korean Peninsula. As we've mentioned, a nuclear war would engulf the whole region. It's not a nuclear war against North Korea. It would inevitably engulf the whole peninsula and neighboring countries, and it would be could be a stepping stone towards escalation. I can say that there are plans to use tactical nuclear weapons against North Korea. This is not, and there's also evidence, very recent evidence of advanced war preparations against North Korea. Now, I should say that the fact that there are war preparations doesn't necessarily mean that a war will take place, because those war preparations are persistent. There's a permanent war preparations against those four countries that I mentioned. Okay, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. But nonetheless, it's on the drawing board of the Pentagon, and it is something which is contemplated. And I should mention that the United States, when they wage wars, they usually like other people to do the dirty work for them. And in this case, they're creating a situation of confrontation between North and South Korea, which is exceedingly dangerous. And of course, if there is a war, then it will engulf the whole peninsula. They know that, okay? They know it. Unfortunately, there's also a process of propaganda now within South Korea, despite the fact that the recently elected president, President Moon, has historically been a progressive figure, both seeking dialogue and exchange with North Korea, and that movement that movement, of course, is very important. It's called the Sunshine Movement, which they want to, large sectors of South Korea want to pursue that objective. It was initiated in 1998 with Kim Dae-jung, the President Kim Dae-jung, and ultimately this is, of course, very important. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, there's also the danger of escalation, and then there's the question of what kind of peace project could be put forward. I've given a lot of thought to that, and I'd like to maybe complete the discussion focusing on peace initiatives. We had in 1953 the signing of this controversial armistice to which Eva Bartlett referred earlier. Now, I was in South Korea for the anniversary in 2013. The problem is that for this armistice agreement to be rescinded, so to speak, the three parties of the armistice, which are the United States, North Korea, and China, representing the People's Volunteer Army. These three countries would have to agree on peace negotiations. Systematically, for the last 67, not 67, no, since 53, in other words, 64 years, since the signing of this agreement, the United States has refused to enter into negotiations. And this goes back right to the beginning. North Korea has demanded, requested on numerous occasions the holding of peace negotiations, but the United States has refused to enter into negotiations. And we've seen what has happened in recent developments where Rex Tillerson made a statement, I think it was last week, where he said, we're prepared now to enter into peace negotiations with no preconditions. And the North Koreans would have accepted that. But his statement was immediately nullified by the White House and the State Department and said there's no question of entering into negotiations with North Korea without setting certain conditions, of course. And some of those conditions might mean the stationing of US troops in North Korea. I'm not joking, because they're documents that intimate that to take place. So the question is, if the armistice cannot be replaced by a peace treaty, the alternative would be for North and South Korea to reach a bilateral agreement. This is the object of discussion in South Korea. I've had long debates when I visit South Korea on a regular basis for more than 10 years. The issue would be for the North and the South to reach an agreement, but we have to put this in context, because at the moment, and this is something which is very important, at the moment, the United States and South Korea have a defense cooperation agreement, which is called Operations Control. It has several names, but essentially what it means is that South Korea and the United States have a defense cooperation agreement whereby, whereby in case of war, the entire forces of South Korea would be under US command. Okay? That means several million troops and aircraft, etc., etc. Now, in effect, when I said that they like to make other people do the dirty work for them, under this defense cooperation agreement, de facto they control all South Korean armed forces. From the army, the air force, etc., right up to the top. There is the president of South Korea is also commander-in-chief, but they say he or she is only commander-in-chief in a peace, under conditions of peace. Okay, but since the armistice agreement is there, the North Korea and the United States are still at war, technically. Okay, they haven't signed a peace agreement. So that de facto, the armed forces of the entire South Korean armed forces are under the jurisdiction of a 3-star general appointed by the Pentagon. I think he's 3. Okay, now that means that they have this Korea Command. They have 27,000 troops which are there, and the way, the avenue which is debated I put this forth also in presentations in South Korea, is that the North and the South agree on a process of demilitarization of the Korean Peninsula, whereby precondition to the signing of a peace agreement between North and South Korea is to nullify the Operation Control, which is the basis of this cooperation agreement, and ultimately then negotiate bilaterally between North and South with conditions that the US troops would withdraw from the Korean Peninsula. That prospect is most probably not possible under the present arrangement, because the United States control the Ministry of Defense of South Korea, they control the armed forces, and even with the appointment of the new president, the repeal of the cooperation agreement is not going to take place, because he is essentially being overridden by the Pentagon and their representatives in the South Korean defense forces. So that is the background of this situation. I think it's absolutely, and I'll conclude, it's absolutely essential that in Canada we take this opportunity to initiate a broad campaign, not strictly a campaign against war against Korea, but a broader campaign against war. But I think the central issue is the issue of nuclear weapons and the consequences of a nuclear weapons attack, wherever that attack takes place, whether it's against Iran or whether it's against North Korea. These are the two targeted countries for the moment. That the broader public has to understand that this kind of war would be very different from previous wars. It doesn't compare to the wars in Yemen or the wars in Libya or Iraq or Vietnam. But once you start using nuclear weapons in a conventional war theater, it's the road to World War III. And the problem is that it's based on a couple of very fundamental lies, that these tactical nuclear weapons are peacemaking bombs, so that the lie becomes the truth. And unfortunately, the truth which we try to convey then is categorized as conspiracy theory, okay, or fake news. But I can tell you, there's nothing fake about a tactical nuclear bomb. 6 times Hiroshima. And the fact that these are being deployed, and they're being deployed as conventional weapons. That is what we have to address. And I think we have to confront our governments, and we have to reach out broadly across Canada and internationally to prevent the use of these weapons of mass destruction. The initiative, which was launched with the motion of the United Nations, is of course very important, but that motion did not really address the geopolitics of nuclear weapons. There are other nuclear weapon states, certainly, but the only nuclear weapon states that have a first strike preemptive approach are the United States and their allies, plus Israel. Okay? Israel is prepared to use nuclear weapons against Iran. It hasn't excluded that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that the scientific analysis of radiation resulting from a nuclear bomb is, so to speak, dismissed, creates a certain legitimacy for the use of these nuclear weapons. So that is the background, and I think we should proceed then with Q&A and discussion on these and related issues. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a couple of brief announcements and then we'll go into Q&A. Apparently Michelle's books and Mark Taliano's book, as well as books from the Hamilton Coalition Stop the War, are available on the literature tables at the back. Michelle has apparently agreed to autograph his books after the Q&A. Doug Brown is going to make, Doug, where are you? Brief fundraising speech right now, is it?
Oh, sure. Brief. I'm co-chair of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, and to hold events like these, we always hold free events, but to run as an organization, we're a very lean organization, but energetic. We do spend some money. It's necessary to operate anything, to hold public events, to be able to maintain the website and do any activities at all. So this is a free event, but we will, Ken Stone has a cookie jar and or a cookie tin, and this will be passed around. If you would like to support our activities in any way, we'd be very appreciative. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Michelle has agreed to take questions, and let's get into it. I will try and direct traffic. Yes?
I'm just wondering about,
Speak up loudly, please.
I'm just wondering about the use, I know while it's not a tactical nuclear weapon per se, what about the use of depleted uranium munitions?
Well, that's a very important question. That also creates cancer. And they use it in, they've used it in Iraq, they use it in Yugoslavia. And, but it's much more localized, but it's certainly an issue. Kosovo, children in Kosovo, the percentage of, actually we do have data on that. They did collect information on that, but it has been also very much, I think, pushed to the bottom of the news chain. It's not an issue for discussion. It's the depleted uranium ammunition in conventional weapons that is being used, which has effects of radiation and which cause cancer, definitely. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes?
I think the focus on nuclear weapons makes a lot of sense. But I think the biggest evil we're facing is something I've heard referred to as the Washington Consensus, which is an institutional belief in America principally, but around the world as well, that we need America as a world policeman. And that's what gives them the right to interfere in our elections and, when necessary, go to war, as they did in Iraq in their minds. So I'm just asking, do you think that that would be a better focus to try to understand and crack the belief in America that they have to rule the world?
Well, I couldn't agree more. The Washington Consensus, to start with, was economics. It was the Washington Consensus on Macroeconomic Reform, which then was labeled neoliberalism. But I recall the big, long-standing debate that we had on that. It was the consensus of the U.S. Treasury, the IMF, the World Bank, essentially that was, and the think tanks.
So I'm sorry, what I'm referring to is the CIA putting their finger in elections all around the world and attempting to manipulate governments and military forces rather than economics.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're talking about the CIA ops in favor of, let's say, regime change, intervention in elections, of course, we have a lot of documentation on that. I think that's part of the broader military agenda. Because there's certain countries where you don't need to go in and send troops. The project for the New American Century, it distinguishes between theater operations and constabulary functions, where you would send in special forces, perhaps. Or then the other option is regime change, where you infiltrate and you create conflict within certain countries, or you fund terrorists. Okay, you sponsor ISIS, Al Qaeda, all of these terrorist entities. Maybe some people don't. There's a lot of proof on that. Okay, there are different points of view, but Al Qaeda is a creation of the CIA and always is an asset. Not to say that it's an agent, it's an asset. They're using them for specific purposes and they protect them. But so there are various forms of intervention. In Syria, there was no official US military presence until they launched the so-called counter-terrorism op. Okay? They weren't going after the terrorists, they were protecting the terrorists. But that's another debate. I think the reason why this evening we're stressing nuclear weapons and nuclear war is that kind of war ultimately leads to the destruction of humanity. And they're very different from the other wars that there's a genocide ongoing in Yemen. And we know that the US is behind that. Well, they do it through their allies, Saudi Arabia. And the weapons are coming from the United States and Canada. Okay? So that's the background. I think it's a very, very complex situation. It's also tied in with a process of impoverishment, which is the application of the IMF World Bank reforms, the imposition of conditionalities on debt, essentially in third world countries, but also the types of reforms which are now being implemented in the advanced Western countries. Okay, the phasing out of the welfare state, the freezing of wages. Countries like Greece, Portugal, Italy, up to a point, are going through this process, and it's tied in to militarization. And the allocation of resources, again, between the so-called military-industrial complex on the one hand and the expenditures, let's say, in health, education, and so on. We see that occurring. So yes, the objective ultimately is to question the legitimacy of the Washington Consensus. You might say that that's global capitalism.
Thank you. Thank you for that suggestion. Yes, Bob.
Michelle, I don't know if you're aware of the high-frequency active auroral research program in Alaska, but I think I had read something of your writing about it, and just so the audience is appreciative of what's involved, 180 electromagnetic...
Bob, could you talk a little louder?
Sorry. Electromagnetic wave generators that are influencing our atmosphere, and in particular the ionosphere, in ways that are linked apparently to the military, because the Navy and the Air Force were instrumental in starting this system in 1992, I believe it was. And Raytheon, you know, that peace-loving organization that wants to keep us all safe, was managing it until very recently, and I guess there was a bit of an outcry about it. And now it's being managed by the Geophysical Institute of the University of Alaska Fairbanks to make it appear as if it's, you know, all in wanting to learn more about the atmosphere and how it functions, et cetera, et cetera. But
I don't want to let you to go on too long, Bob. So did you want a specific question, or did you just want Michelle to comment on?
Let me comment, because I'm familiar with that project.
okay, sure.
The project itself was moved from Gakona, Alaska, to some unknown location. It hasn't been rescinded, and your observations on the University of Alaska taking over the sort of scientific analysis. If people want to learn about that project, there's a CP, and because if they don't believe independent media, well, listen to CBC. There's a video, there's a documentary on the HARP project, which documents it very carefully, and that documentary goes back to the 90s, okay? It was not subject to censorship. There's another one, I think it's by I'm not sure, it's a US source, but in any event, I can say from my own, I did some research on that, it was a long time ago, but I can say that electromagnetic warfare is fully operational. And we're talking about climatic disruptions used through these environmental modification techniques. And if you read the literature on that and the statements from the US Air Force, because it was the US Air Force which was actually managing this station in Alaska, you will certainly understand what they're talking about, because they do talk about weather warfare. They talk about weather warfare, and then they say that the convenience of weather warfare is that the enemy doesn't know that you're actually pulling the strings. Okay, you have quotations from U.S. Air Force sources. Now, this is of course a weapon of mass destruction as well, and it's now within the realm of total secrecy. And I can say that by the mid-90s, the HARP program was fully operational. It was fully operational in terms of abilities to trigger weather modification in different parts of the world. And that is confirmed again by their own documents. And there is still a possibility that they did use it against targeted countries, including North Korea. But we have absolutely no proof to that effect.
Thank you, Michelle.
In his introductory remarks, the Master of Ceremonies said at the very least that the peace movement, as we used to know it, is asleep. Do you have a concrete proposal to make that maybe Canada could become active again in an obvious way to cry out against many of the things you talked about tonight and the threat of nuclear annihilation?
Well, that's something, you know, that's something that has to be developed. I don't think we should build upon existing structures, because there are peace movements. I'm not passing a judgment. I was part of the collective in Montreal, but when people consider Syria or Yemen as being a civil war, you know, then there's no use in having a peace, an anti-war movement. Because say, oh, it's a civil war, we don't take any stance on civil wars, okay? We only look at the humanitarian dimension. So they'll say Libya was a civil war, then there was a humanitarian intervention with NATO, and so on. We see what the peace movement stays mum on these issues. And after 9/11, the United States and NATO invaded Afghanistan. Now, nobody had I won't address 9/11, just the justification for that war was twofold. One, they said that Afghanistan had attacked America. They didn't actually say, they said an attack emanating from a foreign power, okay? I mean, it was Afghanistan. It was then discussed at the North Atlantic Council starting on the 12th of September. And then they said, yes, Al-Qaeda is behind it, and Afghanistan is supporting Al-Qaeda. And then, when the Afghani government, the so-called Taliban, through diplomatic channels in the course of the month of September, contacted the US State Department and said, we are prepared to deliver Osama bin Laden to the US justice system under certain conditions. If you give us some evidence, blah, 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 we will abide by that. And George W. Bush says, we don't negotiate with terrorists, okay? And then, through diplomatic channels again, they said, if you have any evidence, etc., that he was behind it, we will abide and collaborate with you. None of that, of course, made the headlines, okay? But we invaded Afghanistan on the pretext that Afghanistan had attacked America. From a legal point of view, that's what it was, okay? Now, who moved? Nobody. They're all praising this act of reprisal, and even progressive organization. I think people were very confused and very shocked with what happened on 9/11. But then what, this faraway country in Central Asia was behind it with that they come in with their jets and so on. And no, we didn't see any Afghani jet fighters in the skies of New York that day, right? So they may have been terrorists. I don't want to enter that discussion, but there was no state sponsorship by the Afghani government to attack America. But we believed in that. And then the second thing is, you don't prepare a large-scale theater war several thousand miles away in 4 weeks. From the 12th, from the 11th of September to the 7th of October. Impossible, okay? When they decided, the War Cabinet convened in the evening of 9/11, they called it a War Cabinet, and they said they declared war on Afghanistan, and the following day, the North Atlantic Council passed a motion. They didn't take the decision immediately, but they essentially supported supported a military operation against Afghanistan, which was totally illegal and unjustified, but everybody swallowed it. So my answer to the question is, we have to also address media disinformation, propaganda, telling us things which are totally absurd, okay? Like saying nuclear weapons are harmless to civilians, or that the Afghan government attacked America. Anybody disagree with that statement? Did Afghanistan attack America on September 11? No. Okay. And no military analyst would mention, and they know it, that you don't prepare a large-scale theater war in 4 weeks. It took this, about a month for us to prepare this venue here, right?
Somewhat more modest.
Yeah.
Somewhat more modest. Could I add a comment, Michelle?
Sure.
Thank you for that very practical question. We did spend a few hours this afternoon, a few of us with Michelle, sitting down, doing a little bit of brainstorming about where do you start from here to spark the movement, to get things going again. And rather than try and give what we came up with, I would just encourage us of the people who are here tonight to meet and consider these issues. What is required? Because you probably know as much as I do about what we need to do to change things. Now, folks, I'm supposed to be the MC here, and we've got just a couple more minutes. So I think I'll take one more question, and then we'll thank our speaker and thank you and send you on your way. Any final question? Don?
It may not be as relevant as some of the earlier questions, but one of the features of the propaganda behind the threats to North Korea is that this is an extremely backward country because the government is so terrible that it has made life absolutely miserable for the people of North Korea. And what Eva was showing us earlier indicates otherwise, and I think what you were showing is what are the best pieces to use to humanize North Korea so that it is not just some rocket man that we're going to attack. It is a country of however many million people.
Well, I think it's very important that, first of all, that we recognize that this country, which was totally destroyed in 1953, has built a very comprehensive welfare state with 99% literacy. There's no country, I mean, the United States has 84 to 86% literacy, okay? Universal education, universal health, and so on. If we analyze, and the comparison should not be in relation to the US, even though those indicators are very much reveal the failures of US social policy. But let's compare them to some of the proxy states which the United States destroyed in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Cambodia, the Philippines, Indonesia. Okay? Look at the situation in Indonesia today. Look at the mass poverty and the type of post-colonial US society which has been installed. I mean, I've traveled to Southeast Asia almost every year. The only countries which have virtually are distinct from what I've described are Malaysia, Thailand, not quite, but let's say you could say Malaysia, Thailand up to a certain point, Taiwan, and the two Koreas, okay, and the rest of the landscape of Southeast Asia and East Asia, it's, well, Japan, I'm sorry, but again, countries which were dominated by the US, okay, or which were the victims of US-led wars. We see exactly what kind of society emerges from these conflicts. Maybe one more. There was.
It's up to you.
Yeah, sure. Fine.
This gentleman back here.
Yeah. We'll take two.
Why don't you comment on the role of what Russia could play on the Korean Peninsula?
It's a very difficult question because a lot of negotiations are taking place behind closed doors. Russia has taken a stance. They're not. Neither Russia nor China favor the North Koreans' nuclear weapons program. That they're clear on that. The Chinese are not particularly friendly to the North Koreans at this juncture. There's a lot of, I think it's important that both China and Russia take a stance in the United Nations Security Council. But more than that, China has caved in on the sanctions. We were expecting that they would retain certain channels of trade, because China is the largest trading country with regard to North Korea, okay? The US threats directed against China were, if you don't do it, we'll damage you. There were threats with regard to intellectual property and so on. But the Chinese did not lash back and say, well, listen, if you do that, we cut off your exports to the United States, okay? There was very little negotiation. They caved in. And I think I should mention that if you, within Chinese business communities and Chinese intellectuals, there is a very pro-US stance, okay? The fact that China is surrounded by US military facilities is known, but nobody talks about it. But I know, at least from my visits to China, that among intellectuals, in other words, the Academy of Social Sciences and the universities, there is a very pro-US elite. And you also find that within the business communities. It's not homogeneous, but again, it's there, and they do business, and of course they have extensive trade with the United States. Now the Russian position is somewhat different, I think, in that they are very much concerned in brokering peace, but increasingly the Chinese and the Russians coordinate their stance. And that's because the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is becoming a new hub, a geopolitical hub. I should mention that this also has a bearing on other countries. The fact is that India and Pakistan are members of the SCO, and Pakistan is heavily aligned with China's Belt and Road Initiative, its trade and investment projects. And so that there's a shift in alliances which is occurring. And that shift in alliances is I think, is an element of maybe of greater stability, but at the same time, we're at a very, very dangerous crossroads. And I mentioned at the beginning, or did I, in the night when I didn't, and I'll mention it now, this is a good way to conclude. Yeah, that in the 50s, when there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK and Nikolai Khrushchev negotiated. There were lines of communication between the Soviet Union and the United States on the Cuban Missile Crisis because they realized that they had an understanding of nuclear annihilation. They understood it. And they understood that they had to come to an agreement. And they did come to an agreement. We're not in that situation today. We have the Russiagate process, which is there to accusing Russia of interfering in the US elections, which is, of course, nonsensical. There's a whole curtailment of diplomatic relations. There's the issue of Russian media in the United States and vice versa. And we're in a very dangerous situation because the major powers, particularly Russia and the United States, are not communicating on issues which affect global security. So I think we can rightly say that this is a far more dangerous juncture in our history when compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where JFK, President Kennedy, and the Russian Chairman Khrushchev met and reached an agreement on the missiles which were stationed in Cuba.
We are going to officially thank Michel. I should say he drove for a long time through snow to get here today and then was subjected to hours of